Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself is located on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're so pleased you could join us here tonight, both in person and virtually, for the Winnipeg launch of To Heaven Is Written, the Kingdom Poets Book of World Christian Poetry, published by Cascade, an imprint of Stock. We're very grateful to them for publishing the book in the first place, of course. We'll be joined by editor Burl Horniachek, who you'll be hearing from in just a moment, and also special guests Sarah Klassen, Ito and Joanne Epp. Just a few very brief housekeeping notes right out of the gate. The first is that there'll be a series of readings followed by a conversation which will take place at these stools to my left. After that, if time permits, there'll be the opportunity to ask questions. If you're watching online, please feel free to write those questions into the chat and we'll put them to the panelists as time permits. If you have to be located here, just because we have multiple microphones in use, we'll be bringing forward this microphone right there, so you can feel free to wander up and ask your question as well. At the end of the event, I'll be back to review signing procedure and offer a few closing housekeeping notes. The only thing I'll put in your brain right now is that there'll be a brief pause at the end of the event while we safely transport Burl over to his signing table beside our cash desk. And I'll have more thrilling details on signing procedure at that point. I now have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's participants because we do have an all-star cast with us this evening. Joanne Epp is the author of two poetry collections, Eigenheim, which was published in 2015, and Cattail Skyline, published in 2021, which was shortlisted for the Lansdowne Prize for Poetry at the 2022 Manitoba Book Awards. She lives in Winnipeg, where she serves as an assistant organist at St. Margaret's Anglican Church. Sally Ito is a poet and translator living in Winnipeg. Her first book of translated poetry with co-translator Michiko Sugoi was Are You an Echo? The Lost Poetry of Misuzu Kaneko, published in 2016 by Chin Music Press. Her most recent collection of poetry, Heart's Hydrography, was published in 2022 by Turnstone Press. Born and raised in Manitoba's Interlake, Sarah Klassen is an acclaimed award-winning author of 4 works of fiction, including the historical novel The Russian Daughter, which was nominated for the Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction at the 2023 Manitoba Book Awards. She is also the author of 8 collections of poetry and an accomplished traveler. Burl Horniachek grew up near Edmonton, went to the University of Toronto to study ancient Near Eastern studies, Hebrew and ancient Israel, and eventually came back to study creative writing with Nobel Prize winner Derek Walcott at the University of Alberta. His wife is from Winnipeg, and they now live in Selkirk. He worked for many years as a high school teacher and now mostly takes care of their 2 children. To tell us more, please join me in welcoming Burl Horniachek.
Well, thank you so much for coming out this evening, and I hope we have a little bit of fun this evening. But before that, I do want to mention somebody that was not really a mentor of me, but someone who encouraged me in my translation and editing work, and that is the translator Edith Grossman, who passed away this past week. She was most well known as the translator of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, as well as the novel Don Quixote by Cervantes. And some of her work appears in the anthology. She is the translator of the excerpt of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and so I just wanted to acknowledge her. She was encouraging of my work, and so it's sad to hear of her passing this week. We're going to be starting off with a reading of 4 poets. I'm going to be reading 2 on my own, and then Sarah and Sally will be reading a little bit from their translations, and then Joanne and I will also be reading from we're going to finish off a little bit of a dramatic dialogue together, which is featured in the book. So the first poem is by a fellow called Saint Yared, who lived in the 500s in Ethiopia, and he was a hymn writer, composer, and priest. And so this poem is called The Assumption of Mary, and so I'll start off right here. So there, in Abraham's burial plot, sister of him who brought down the law, whose father fought the giant, shines the pearl long sought, where in her clothing's herbal scented knot he is caught. The honored star, whose light is spread out far over the earth, her deeds are, yes they are, known in Lyda's square. To George, who's buried there, dear lady, send your prayer, that he should make our foes to spare. Purest bridal rue, liberator in whom divinity came to be enwombed. She wears his glory as fit costume, who is also Moses' burning broom. Holy of holies is your name, for always have your lips declaimed, pure honey, O most blessed dame. Treasure chest where God interred his everlasting word, the halo that begirds the moon, heat transferred from the sun, your fruit deferred to the belly makes wisdom heard, flaming tree, which has the understanding stirred. Heaven names her as his dove, since she is paragon of silence, humility, and love. The Lord of all was swayed by the beauty of this maid, the daughter of light arrayed to be salvation's aid. She was the bridal arcade where Jesus' grandeur was displayed, the gate that glory to men conveyed. Mary, great bearer of the light, hear our terrible plight. New calf, it is you we praise. Angels name you for the rest of days, dear sister to the human race. Mary, whom they call upright, a virginity so bright, corruption cannot blight such wool of purest white, or cloud of clearest light ringed by seraphim in the flight. O Mary, hear our plea, that his kingdom we might see when his coming he decrees. Let him have us stand before him. Let him call us to adore him. Jesus Christ, eternal Lord then. So the next poet is almost about 800 years later. This is Dafydd ap Gwilym, who is a Welsh poet. And so he's kind of in the high Middle Ages period. And this poem is called the Skylark. The skylark every day takes flight up from his house by earliest light, rising towards heaven. He, the singer of golden song, the April bringer, master of rhyme, whose work is sweet, whose labor is a grateful feat. The gray-winged skylark sings in roves above the quiet hazel groves. Yes, you whose mind and more than speech have taught you well your faith to preach. Praise God as did Sir Kay with passion, visit the stars fitfully flashing, tracing their motions, pouring song down from the well of strength. How strong you store the world, a chapel wide, where you make your music as you glide. Look how you've done your work, how well, such priceless truths of faith you tell, or rather sing, honoring God, and how you've garnered your reward. Let every virtuous being praise his maker and his pristine ways. As he decrees, praise him forever, as thousands do, forget him never. Singer of love songs, author too, in gray-bound garments, where are you? Your voice is gentle, pure and clear, your songs inspired, a joy to hear. You are good omen, hence to be a cantor to the deity, with skill and privileges blessed, and if white-capped, wear a gray crest. Rise and discover, songful bird, that unspoiled place, and there be heard. And after you're safely there, one day, the longest of the year, you may notice a man who seems aware of who you are and why you're there. He'll say that God, the one in three, will not consign you to a tree, but keep you close to show his face, and there share his miracles and grace. Singer of praise for countless things, come down with blessings on your wings, and be my envoy, brother mine. Go to my lady with a sign, to greet her and her many graces, fair as Gwyned's moon her face is. Beg of her a kiss or two, and bring those back to me brand new. Lord of that airy sea beside, her court where I would gladly bide, with her forever from this day, let rivals rage as rage they may. For killing you, the fine is such, that you fear no creature's touch. Envious Jalu might think of trying. It is he who'd face the fear of dying. The sky is yours, a comfy perch, where you're safe as one in church. Far from the arrow and the bow, where he, Jalu, seething below, cursing his rival, passes by, and never more be moved to try. Well, for the next reading, we're going to have Sarah Klassen and Sally Ito read some of their translations of Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg. So, okay.
We, together with Sarah, have translated some sonnets by the Austrian poet Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg, who lived in the 17th century. Okay. I'm going to read one. She wrote a long sequence of sonnets that kind of follow the sequence of the church year. And I should say that some of our sonnets in this book, our translations, I should say, plus many more, are going to be published as a collection by CMU Press later this year. On the Holy Spirit's wondrous consolation. Refreshment from on high, heart-quickening breath, you heavenly balm, in suffering, joy spirit that comforts while defying death and trouble, and calls forth in us joy more plenteous than sorrow. Oh, let my life behold your heart illumination. Let misery be mocked while you are ever praised, and I by you sustained with health and strength. Waft over troubled waters as when the world began. You good God Spirit, pain conqueror, overthrow the soul deceiver. Let not his heart-tormenting fire consume faith's oil in my lamp. Let not his torturous grappling hooks ensnare me. Bedew my rose, O sweet soul's dew, so she may rise up through your cooling strength.
On the glorious wonder of God's reign. O you, whose wisdom dews the stars, the source of destiny, and yet without their work, your art alone brings everything to pass, displays your strength, from which heaven's powers in highest meekness flee. Your royal staff streams of light, of righteousness and goodness. Wrapped in wonder, I mark your tender care for your creation's crown, as for the slightest speck. No fiery angel mind attains your loving kindness. You spin a happiness web of 1,000 threads in all the starry spheres, in all earth places. All effort must be offered to the work that you begin. Your all-providing power prepares the way. You pull the cord to which all hearts are clinging and bring the mind's design through action into being.
Okay, the next reading that we're going to do is, I thought we'd finish off with a little bit of a dramatic dialogue. And this one is by, well, the name of the drama is called The Sacrifice of Abraham. But it's not entirely sure who the author is, but the best guess is a fellow called Vitsentzos Kornaros. And this was a Greek Cretan poet writing in the late 1500s and early 1600s. So this is a dialogue between the patriarch Abraham and his wife Sarah, and it's about of course, the sacrifice of Abraham of their son Isaac. So Joanne will be reading the part of Sarah, and I will be reading the part of Abraham. So, please start.
Oh, woe and suffering. Oh, frightful mystery. Oh, power. When people tell me, child, that you have turned into a flower. And you, how will you nerve yourself for slaughter, for the killing of such a blameless body? Won't you freeze and be unwilling? And do you want your vision to go black, the light abhor you as you behold your dying child when he expires before you? How will you have the strength of heart to listen to his cries when like a lamb his body twists and turns before your eyes? And you, O heedful child, where are you headed? Do you know? To what place do they summon you? Down what road do you go? As for your father and your mother, how long will we wait for your return? What week, what month, what season, or what date? And oh, my heart with all its trembling leaves, will it not quake to hear another child called by your name? My heart will break. My child, how will I bear to be apart from you? How hear the voice of someone else and not the one I hold most dear? My child, is it because you wanted to desert your mother you turned out so obedient, more so than any other? As long as I shall live, my son, I never will allow another boy to speak to me. This is a solemn vow. My eyes will be cast down upon the earth and never stray. And so forever I'll recall the message of this day.
Sarah, don't heap more toil and suffering on my heart. Don't rave and make me as dishonored in my old age as a slave. Don't frighten me from my resolve so that I hesitate and use the weapon on myself and meet an evil fate. Gather your wits, amend your errors, for the things you say, these utterances, do not please the Lord in any way. Who is it you oppose? Why does your weeping never rest? Why is it that you never question God's commands and his behest? Our child, our bodies, souls, well-being are all God's alone. It all belongs to the Creator. Nothing is our own. Just let God shed his grace as I set off on the path of sacrifice, and may my offering appease his wrath. I do not want to linger any longer nor delay. I'll wake the child, get him up, and then be on my way.
9 months I carried you, my cargo, dearest child, who'd nestle inside my body, this unlucky hull, this darkened vessel. For 3 years, son, I gave you milk from my breasts day and night, for you who were my very eyes, who were my very light. I watched you as you grew, how like a tree's branch grew apace, and you increased in virtue and in wisdom and in grace. Now tell me, child, what joy you plan to give to me, I wonder, when you'll be lost and melt away like lightning or like thunder. And as for me, how will I live without you, all bereft? What courage will I have in age? What freshness will be left? When God announced to us, to both together, man and wife, you would be born to us, what joy that brought into our life. O wretched house of Abraham, what happiness the birth of you, my child, was brought to it when you appeared on earth. How do such joys turn into sorrows in a single day? How do the good things scatter like a cloud that blows away?
Let us not dwell upon these things when he's destined to die. What help is it to him? What good is it to cry and cry? You only weary God who takes no joy in our fulfilling the oath and sacrifice because he sees we are unwilling. Banish these sighs, banish this bitterness that's so distressing. Let us give thanks to our Creator, the source of every blessing. That's the end of the dialogue, and so we're going to move into the second part of the program, and Sarah Klassen is going to be asking me a few questions about the book and the process of editing it. And so Sarah, if you could sit right here, and I will sit right on the end here.
So I don't have to switch this on, it'll be on.
It's on, absolutely.
And mine is on as well.
I will be in just one moment. And now you're live.
Thank you very much.
Are we ready?
I think we're ready to go.
This book that we're celebrating today is a really an unusual anthology, and I would say very ambitious. This book gathers together centuries of Christian poetry from the 4th century up until 1800. It includes a diversity of poets who come from a diversity of languages and cultures, and they write in various styles and various forms, and they reflect different Christian traditions. And it's such a big job. I like to use the word big for this book, even though it's a fairly medium size.
Yeah.
But I think the logical first question would be, how did this happen? Why?
Well, there's, I'll answer the sort of short version is that it took about 5 or 6 years for the actual compilation of this once I got the approval from the editor of my publisher. But of course, there's been a long background to this anthology. I don't think anyone could have just picked up and done it right off from scratch. So as part of the history, I think I would go back to my interest in different Bible translations. Would be my interest in the differences of interpretation that you see, and the differences of expression of how things are worded. And you notice that some are a little bit better than others, and others make certain points that others don't. So I was always interested in that aspect immediately from when I encountered the Bible growing up in church. As I grew up and became more interested in poetry as well, I also became quite interested in when you see a poem that is translated by different people from different languages, they are often very different. And I found that extremely fascinating, that you could start with the same ideas and images and come up with something that's quite different. So that kind of fueled my interest in translation. And I'd also say that it's partially fueled, I think, as just a desire to let people know about all of the different Christian poets from all of these different places and traditions around the world. And that's been, I really want people to know about these fabulous poets that are out there from, quite unusual places and places you wouldn't necessarily think of.
Well, a translation is, I would say, a marginal occupation, and it's wonderful if you can love that occupation that you're involved in.
Mm-hmm.
So what were some of your sources, and where did you go? You had to collect all these poems?
Well, I'm a certain amount of it, of course, was from my prior reading, the books that I've collected on my own. But I'd also like to, I went to some of the bigger libraries in Canada, especially University of Toronto, University of Alberta. University of Manitoba has a fantastic collection of Slavic poetry, and a lot of there's a good amount of Polish poetry in this anthology, and most of that I read from books from the University of Manitoba. I looked at a lot of some of the material I got from online. There's various translations out there on websites, and if there was a hole in the library collections, I would order the used copies for myself. And so it really was a process of bringing all of this stuff together from very different different places.
Well, I'm sure you have many shelves of books in your home.
Well, I don't know, shelves, my wife will attest that they're more like a bunch of Rubbermaids sitting in the basement.
whatever works. So you had all of these poems, these dozens and dozens of translated poems to choose from, and you chose four poets that we just listened to now. And I was wondering, why did you choose these four? What guided your selection of these four poets?
Well, the first one I picked up was Saint Yared, who was a Ethiopian hymn writer, and in the Ethiopian service books, he is one of the most prominent writers of hymns in that tradition. So that was one of the things. Again, the book is partially about letting people know about the tradition, the Christian traditions outside of Europe. I wanted to let people know about those, whether that's Ethiopia or Mexico or Philippines or whatever. So that was one reason why I chose it. The other reason is that it's one of the pieces that I translated myself, or not really translated, but interpreted. There's been quite a, I've told this story to a lot of people about my adventures trying to get some of the Ethiopian poetry in this book. Saint Yared was often recommended to me by different people from the Ethiopian tradition when I asked about, who should I include in this book. And it was the hardest part of the book to get into the book. The first person who was going to translate it had some personal issues and had to drop out, and then they recommended somebody else, and then there was a civil war that broke out in Ethiopia at the time, and so that didn't work out. And then Eventually, I found some fellow professor at the University of London called Ralph Lee, who had some rough translations that he had translated, but they weren't very poetic. So I had to jazz them up a little bit with his permission and his help. And I also want to mention that there are, the Ethiopian tradition is an extremely rich poetic tradition, but some of it is entirely oral. And there are some Christian poets out there whose work has never actually been written down. It's just part of an oral devotional tradition. And I remarked to some people that I really just couldn't get to Ethiopia, especially not in the middle of a pandemic, write down to collect some poetry from an oral tradition. But that was something I had to really work hard to include some of this poetry from that tradition, and I'm very happy that I did. That's something that I'm a little bit proud of.
That must be one of the more interesting poems that you had to chase down and try to nail down and get into your collection then. Yeah. So I noticed the first of the poems that you read had what I would call the monorhyme. And an interesting shape, which people can see once they buy the book and page through it. It's got a particular form, and the monorhyme that it must have been translated from a monorhyme.
It was. I've been very much trying to, not exclusively. I've incorporated a variety of translation styles, but for that one, I wanted to include that reflection of the original form, which is in the monorhyme, where you have the same rhyme going for several ways.
Yeah. The other poem was about the skylark, and I found that one interesting too. And I found there was another poem about a bird, the nightingale, earlier in the book. So for me, it was interesting to see how nature was used in these in the poetry that's translated.
Well, that kind of brings me to some of the stylistic differences that you see. The original, the Ethiopian poem, of course, has it piles up one after the other. There's images for the Virgin Mary, whereas the Daffod's Skylark poem is a little bit more modern. It's kind of similar to some of the nature poetry that we might be used to. So that comes a little bit out of the later Middle Ages. And I also wanted to mention the translator there, very important. Well, I should say translators. The first one on that team was Rina Espayat, who is a Dominican American poet and translator, and she is, as I describe it, my co-conspirator in this project. She was really willing to throw herself into working with a variety of languages with different people, and on this particular poem, she was collaborating with Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. So it was interesting to be able to work with both of those.
With the Skylark, yes. And then, what about the drama? Why did you choose that one, Abraham's story?
Well, as part of this whole process, I often learned a lot of things about history that I didn't know about before, and I really should have known about this, and I think other people should know about it as well. There is a long tradition of Byzantine devotional or not really devotional, but liturgical poetry. It's part of the tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church. and so I have some poetry of that kind in the anthology, and but this particular drama comes from the Renaissance period, and what kind of happened in the Greek world, in the Eastern Orthodox world, is that originally you had all these liturgical poets writing their hymns or their verse sermons for the liturgy. But that kind of ground to a halt a little bit after the Islamic invasions of the Greek world, and there were things that continued, but a lot of the vitality of that particular civilization was kind of it kind of dampened it down. But during the Renaissance, for a period of several hundred years, there was the Venetians, the Italians, ruled the island of Crete, and under this there was a revival of Christian poetry, of sacred drama in this particular case, but also of other types of poetry and art. And so this particular play comes from that Renaissance era. And this was also a time when you had artists like El Greco. El Greco was a Cretan artist, and he came from this particular, what they call the Cretan Renaissance. And so as well, it's kind of interesting as a time period when you had the Eastern Orthodox involved in the Renaissance that was happening in the rest of Europe. There was a sort of Greek-Italian connection there that was going on.
Do you suppose this play was performed?
I don't know myself.
I wondered about that.
Yeah.
I found this a heartbreaking poem. It's the story that is, I would say, the stumbling block for many Christian and non-Christian readers of the Bible, and the way it's presented here. I mean, we say in every story in the Bible, God is the main actor. Well, this story is presented in a way that it's the human beings are the actors and God is in the background. I like the human touch, the story, the domestic part of it, the focus on the mother.
Yeah.
I like to use the word cargo. I carried you as a cargo.
Yeah.
It was quite an amazing poem.
Yeah. And I would also like to thank the translator, who is the very recently elected professor of poetry at Oxford University, A.E. Stallings.
Yes.
And I feel very fortunate to have worked with her, and as well as many other extremely eminent translators on there's some brilliant new translations in this book. And
I would say that you have an impressive lineup of translators: Rowan Williams, Gerard Munley Hopkins, Stallings, Rena, you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But let's go on to the fourth poem, and that is von Greiffenberg.
So I'm going to invite Sally and Joanne to come up, and we're just going to ask a couple of questions here. So I think you can take off the mic, and you can
Just move it over.
And my first question is to Sally. How did you're the person who discovered Greiffenberg, and then you brought it to Sarah and to Joanne. And I'd like to ask you, what's the story behind your discovery of Catharina?
Okay, so my local library is Cornish Library, and they have a big book table, and they have a sale. And I was just, doing my sort of looking through the book table sale, and I found this book, this anthology of sacred poetry by women, edited by Jane Hirschfield. So I picked it up and I just started leafing through it, and I was kind of looking at the sacred poetry of Christians. And that's where I stumbled on Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg. And I read the poem and I was just like quite startled by it. It was just, the language was like kind of like Hopkins, and it had this kind of heroic vigor to it. And I just thought, oh, this is so interesting. I'd like to know more about this poet. So then I started just doing internet research and looking her up. And lo and behold, the University of Manitoba Library had one book of criticism of her poetry by a scholar of the 60s named Flora Kimmich. So I took that book out and read it. But I realized that, there's only so much I could actually understand of this poet in English. Like, she was a German poet, she was writing in German. So I really needed to start talking to people that could actually read the German, because I think that's where I felt like the vitality of her words was coming through in the translation, but there would be more to be found if I could actually find someone else to translate more of her work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask Joanne a little bit. Could you tell us a little bit more about her life and her reputation and her revival in modern times, and just give us a little bit of a sketch about Catharina.
Yeah, well, as I said, she lived in the 17th century. She was Lutheran from the Austrian nobility, but she was Lutheran at a time when the Austrian monarchs were trying to bring back Catholicism. So they were really pushing hard against Lutheranism, and that influenced her social milieu and how she could practice her faith. She was a staunch Lutheran. She went so far as to try to persuade the Austrian Empire to convert to Lutheranism. But in the end, the restrictions on Lutherans grew so severe that almost all of them eventually just left. And she did too, although I think she held out longer than a lot of them. Anyway, her friends and family recognized her as being extremely intelligent. And so she was given a very good education, more so than was typical for a woman of her time. She studied several languages. She read science, mathematics, theology, devotional literature, just very widely read. So she could read French, Italian, and Spanish, as well as Latin. And she did her own translating. She wrote poetry. She wrote a collection of poetry from which we have translated quite a number of sonnets. She also wrote prose works, several series of meditations on the life and passion and death of Christ. The odd thing about her biography that always comes up is that her father died, the family was in a bad financial situation, and her father's half-brother came in and kind of sorted out the family's finances, took over her education and guardianship, and then after a few years declared himself in love with her and wanted her to marry him, which she resisted for a while because she was convinced of her mission to praise God in her writing and to just totally devote herself to God and not marry. But eventually he, I don't know, won her over or wore her down, I'm not sure which, and they did marry. She was, her work was highly regarded in her time. She was, for instance, invited as the only female member of one of the prominent literary societies in Nuremberg. But after her death, she kind of got forgotten. And possibly, possibly because she wrote solely on Christian themes. Whatever she wrote about, it was her faith coming through. And so, in certain eras that was just not as popular, and her Baroque style of writing, which was, of a piece with her time, can feel a bit ornate to modern readers. In any case, she was practically forgotten, or at least badly neglected. And then around the 60s, more scholars started examining her work again and doing scholarship on her work. Not a lot of translation, but more people are studying her work and making it more widely known.
Well, thank you very much. And we have Sue Sorensen here from CMU Press, and there's going to be I believe it's called The Wonderwork, the Selected Sonnets of Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg. And so hopefully there will be a Greiffenberg revival in part due to our esteemed translators here. And I wanted to pick up on one other theme that you're going to find when you read the book, and that is that you're going to notice some stylistic and intellectual trends that go across from poet to poet and from era to era. And one of those is that sort of Baroque / metaphysical style. And it's something that you find in Czech with a poet like Burdell, or you find in Spanish with Quevedo and Góngora, and you find in other poets like I'm forgetting all the names, but that particular style was something that was sort of Europe-wide. And Catharina was one of those, was a participant in that particular style. And they were actually, they were reading a lot of Jesuit Latin poetry, which is something I came to learn after I had compiled this anthology. And there were some scholars that reached out to me to kind of inform me of what was going on. And one last thing, with regard to Catharina, there are several women poets in this anthology that I wanted to highlight. Catharina was one. I mentioned before Sor, who was a Mexican poet, and there's a selection there translated by Edith Grossman in the anthology. There's also Vittoria Colonna, who was an Italian poet. And we have some selections translated by Jan Zwicky, the Governor General winner. And finally, I want to really highlight is particularly the last poet in the book is Anne Griffiths, the Welsh poet. And she was a Welsh hymn writer. She's extremely esteemed, led a little bit of a tragic life. She died at 29 in childbirth. But she is still regarded as one of the most esteemed poets in the Welsh language. So if you're interested in that particular topic, that's something that's in the anthology as well. Now I see we're kind of running out of time. Sarah, did you have any last?
I have some questions. Yes, I do. Is our time up?
Not quite.
Let me ask this one. Just one more question and then our conclusion.
Sounds good.
So I wanted to ask, poets and translators choose their constraints and where they are going to take liberties. So what about translators? What is important in translation? Is it important to translate precisely, as literally as possible? Include everything that the poet says, or is it important to focus on making a beautiful piece of art, even if you have to take shortcuts, or is it important to retain the style and the form and the rhyme of the individual, of the original, or do you make it appealing to the contemporary reader?
Well, that's kind of the beauty of translation, is you can have a bunch of different approaches to a particular poet. Obviously I had to pick the ones that I wanted, and I think I mostly picked on the ones that I thought were the most beautiful, the most the ones that were the most beautiful works of art, as you say. I probably tend to also pick those who convey a little bit of the flavor of the original, the sort of the syntax, the sort of style that's in the original, as well as the original form. But there are many different approaches to translation, and I'm certainly not opposed to translation that attempts to reach out to a contemporary reader and make things more accessible. So I think there's room for them all. I certainly have my own taste, but that's I'm open to a lot of different approaches.
Before we close, Burl, I know that you have translated poetry that predates this book. You've translated from the Hebrew, taking poems from the Hebrew scriptures, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Psalms. Why is translation important? There are translations of all these already available, many, and why is translation important?
I think that as far as new translations, I think there's a few considerations. First of all, in many cases, scholarship improves, particularly of ancient texts. New things are discovered. New commentaries come out, and say with the King James Version, which is an extremely beautiful translation. In many cases, it's either it falls down in its scholarship, or in some cases, it's not as clear as I would prefer. But just in general with translation, no one translator is going to be able to completely capture what is in the original. And so I think there's room for people to keep coming back and trying their hands at texts that have already been translated before. And it's pretty rare that, especially with something as complex as translating poetry, that the person who does it first gets it right or gets it done the best. So I think there's a lot of room, especially in poetry translation, for new translations.
Well, thank you, Burl. And my last question, what's your next project?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm hoping to translate all of the poetic books of the Bible. And so I've been working on that a little bit. Perhaps someday in the near future, I'll start working on bringing a sequel to this anthology, and I'll bring it up from 1800 all the way up to today. So those are a couple, I think those will both keep me busy.
So where is John? Are we having questions from the audience? Oh, here he is.
Hello, Sarah. We do have time for one or two questions if there is anybody out there who has something burning that they might like to ask. If so, what I could always do is actually, rather than use this, just run out with the handheld microphone, allow you to speak quickly, and then bring it back. So if there is anybody who has a question, please just feel free to put your hand up. And if you're not feeling particularly inquisitive, I can always turn things back over to the panel and offer them some closing comments if they'd like.
Well, I think that's about all that I have to say for the evening, but thank you everyone here for coming out. I really appreciate it. And I don't know if anybody else has any more comments. I'm going to add one more thing. If you already have a copy of this anthology, I'm going to note in the process of doing my anthology, I got to know Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and he has his own anthology of religious poetry out, and he didn't want any payment for his work, so I sent him some books by Sarah and Sally, and he included some of their poems in his own anthology, which is, I believe there's a couple copies available in the store. So if you already have a copy of my anthology, you certainly can pick that one up. That's about it.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much for this conversation and for your readings here tonight. We will now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll just safely transport Burl over to the signing table, which is beside our cash desk. There are copies of the anthology available there. There are also copies available at our cash desk. So please do feel free to have a copy signed. Please just do pay for the book before you leave. We have such an incredible wealth of poetic talent up here, and we're so grateful to all of you for making time this evening. So many thanks to Joanne Epp, Sally Ito, and Sarah Klassen, of course. Thank you all for joining us, and please give me, or join me, one final time in applauding Burl Horniachek. Have a wonderful evening.